So it's Pride Month, and if you spend any time on church social media this year, you'll see a lot of congregations falling all over themselves to announce how welcome the queer community is at their church, right? There'll be rainbow flags, quasi affirming statements, new signage, the works, right? And I want to say something about that because it's been sitting with me like all of like last week. Some of those churches mean it, right? Some of those churches are genuinely trying to do the work imperfectly and with real intention. I don't want to be cynical about every gesture towards inclusion because gestures matter and people are watching, and sometimes a sign in the window is the thing that keeps someone alive long enough to find out whether or not the insides match the outsides at a congregation. But here's what I keep noticing. There's this kind of welcome that you get a lot from churches that never becomes belonging. It sounds warm. It says, "We're glad you're here." It smiles at the door. It has great coffee, an accessible website, a friendly vibe you can feel from the moment you walk in. And all of that matters. It can matter. I'm not dismissing that. But there's a difference between being welcomed into a room and being woven into a people. There's a difference between being greeted and being known. There's a difference between let us know if you need anything and someone actually helping you carry what is too heavy. There's a difference between being welcome to show part of who you are and being embraced in the fullness of your becoming. There's a difference between a church that is friendly and a church that has become a structure of care. That's the difference that I want to talk about today. I'm your host, Reverend Andrew Shipley, Pastor Andrew Shipley of Mission Gathering Christian Church, Disciples of Christ. This is the Imaginary Resistance. We're in episode 4, back in Acts 2 again. In the question for today is, what happens when the table stops being a metaphor and becomes a system? So let's go. Before we get into the text, let me quickly anchor where we are in the series, right? Because each week builds on the last, and I want to make sure that there's a scaffolding that's really clear. Week 1, Spirit gives dreams and visions and prophecies to all people, not to a charismatic leader while everyone else watches. The Spirit lands on everyone. And the future belongs not to heroes, but to the Spirit-filled community willing to dream together. Week 2 was visions are not escapes. They have dirt under their fingernails. They become houses and gardens and tables and public love. They're meant to take material form in the world. And week 3 was radical self-love, the holy work of refusing the shame empire has handed us and learning to love what God calls beloved. And now week 4 asks what I think is the logical and necessary next question is, what happens when beloved people try to actually start building something together? What happens when the visions that we get has to become a room, a budget, a meal, a regular practice? What happens when the table stops being an inspiring metaphor and becomes our organizing system? Because that is the move, and it's harder than the vision. It is always harder than the vision. Like, we talk constantly, and especially progressive Christian spaces, about making room at the table, about welcome at the table, about the table of Jesus where all are invited. And that language is deep and meaningful, and I genuinely love it, right? My own tradition, the Disciples of Christ, is all about the table. But sometimes if we're not paying attention, the table becomes only a metaphor. It becomes a pretty image, a sign of inclusion without the practice of redistribution, a symbol of welcome without the structure of belonging. It becomes, and I mean this with full seriousness, a vibe. And Acts 2 is not just giving us a vibe, Acts 2 is giving us a system. Let me read part of Acts 2 again, right? They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to the community, to their shared meals, and to their prayers. All the believers were united and shared everything. They would sell pieces of property and possessions and distribute the proceeds to everyone who needed them. Every day they met together and ate in their homes. They shared food with gladness and simplicity. What strikes me is that this is not a group of people who just had warm feelings about each other. This is a group that reorganized its entire life around care for one another. They prayed together, they learned together, they ate together, they shared resources, they noticed need, they practiced redistribution, they made faith material, they made love visible, they made belonging something you could actually taste. And that's what I mean by the table as a system. Not table as decoration, not table as church branding, table as infrastructure. This shared table as economy, as mutual aid. This table is a place where love stops being an idea and where it becomes organized. The passage begins with a word. I want to stay with that word for a moment. They devoted themselves, right? Not they attended, not they consumed religious content and moved on with their week, not they did all of the things that we think about when we're talking about living in this culture in church. They devoted themselves to the teaching, to the community, shared meals and prayer. And I want to be careful, right? I want to be careful here because church language about devotion has been weaponized, right? Some of us have been in communities where devotion meant going until you burn out, where commitment meant you were not allowed to have limits or boundaries, where service meant you give until you're empty and then being made to feel guilty when there was nothing left. Places where community meant you belonged as long as you were useful enough. That's not the table of Jesus. That's the table of empire dressed in religious language. And we should call it what it is, right? There's no devotion in systems of exploitation. There's only anxiety and fear, which are not the same thing as faithfulness, no matter how productive they look from the outside. What Acts is describing is something different. It's shared life, it's a reciprocal life, a community where you have a place to receive and to give, a place to be fed and to feed, a place to be known, and a place to help carry others. Devotion as mutual belonging rather than institutional obligation. And there's a deep theological point underneath all of this. The Spirit does not create customers, consumers. It doesn't create spectators or spiritual consumers or fans of Jesus who check in on Sundays and otherwise live as isolated private individuals whose faith is essentially their own personal project. The Spirit creates a people, a chosen family. And that is deeply countercultural because everything in our formation trains us towards consumption. We consume content, experiences, brands, spirituality, church. We ask, did I like it? Did it meet my needs? Was it convenient? Was the music good? Did I get something out of it? And those aren't entirely the wrong questions. But if they're on their own, they're radically incomplete. Because the questions of Christian community is not, did I get something out of this? The question is also, who am I becoming with these people? Who is fed because I showed up? Who knows they're not alone because I'm here? Whose burden is lighter because I chose not to disappear? Willie James Jennings in After Whiteness writes, the cultivation of all belonging should be the goal of all education. And I want to extend that, right? This should be the goal of all Christian formation, not just the production of isolated religious experts, not the creation of well-informed consumers of theology, but the cultivation of belonging to God, to one another, to creation, to the wounded and beautiful world God refuses to abandon. Jennings goes on to say this in After Whiteness: Christianity has a belonging problem. And that problem is more than sociological, it's theological. We have accepted and even celebrated forms of faith that leave people deeply alone. Oof. The table forms us into a people who refuse to be deeply alone. And not because everyone is the same or agrees or has the same story, but because around the table, you learn and I learned that our lives are intertwined, that we're interdependent. My hunger matters, and so does yours. My need does not make me a burden. Your abundance does not make you superior. We belong to each other, full stop. That is the first movement of the table. The Spirit creates a people, not spiritual consumers. Acts says that all the believers shared everything. They distributed the proceeds to everyone who needed them. That phrase is so simple, but it's so radical. Everyone who needed them. One of the ways that it's radical is the community noticed need. They didn't spiritualize it away. They didn't say, we'll pray for you, but please don't ask for groceries. We'll welcome you, but please don't need housing. We'll call you family, but please don't need money. We will preach good news to the poor, but please don't make your poverty too inconvenient for us. No, Acts talks about a church where they distributed resources to everyone who needed them. Which means someone had to tell the truth about what they needed. And someone had to tell the truth about the abundance they had to meet those needs. And I think telling those truths, both of them are genuinely hard. Like, it's hard to say, I need help. It's hard to say, I cannot pay this bill, or I'm lonely, or I don't have enough food, or I'm overwhelmed, or I'm not okay. Because most of us were trained to hide our needs. We were taught not to be a burden. Taught that needing help was a form of moral failure, a form of failure in of itself. And for those of you who were raised as men in this society, like, to ask for help was to emasculate yourself. We were taught that if we were faithful enough, strong enough, organized enough, we would not have to need so much. But here's where last week we talked about radical self-love. Here's where that connects directly to what we're talking about today. That need is not a failure. Need is a part of being human. For those of you that are like, well, show me that in the Bible. Before sin enters the story of Genesis, before anything goes wrong, God has already said that it's not good for the human to be alone. Need is not a result of being broken. Need is a part of being a creature. You were made to need air and food and touch and rest and love and community and God. The table, both symbolically and materially, tells the truth that everybody needs. Fritz Fanon's analysis of colonial psychology is useful to us here because one of the most insidious moves colonialism empire makes is convincing the colonized that their needs are shameful, that to need is to be inferior, that dependency is weakness rather than creatureliness, that the internalized colonizer says, be self-sufficient, be productive, do not ask, do not show vulnerability, Do not be a burden. And the church has far too often reinforced that message instead of dismantling it. The table of Acts 2 is a direct repudiation of that formation. Your need does not exile you from the community. Your need reveals where the community gets to become real for you. And the table tells the truth about gifts as well as need. Everyone has something to share. Not the same thing, not the same amount, not all of the time, but something. A meal, a prayer, a ride, a room, a skill, a story, a check in, a little money, a lot of money, a memory, a vision, a prophecy, a moment of care. This is where radical self love stops being an individual practice and becomes a communal one. If I believe I'm beloved, I can tell the truth about my need without having shame attached to it. And if I believe that you are beloved, I can respond to your need without needing to be superior. That's the difference between charity and mutual care. Charity keeps hierarchy intact. One person's the giver, one's the receiver. One gets to feel generous, the other one gets to feel grateful. The table of Jesus disrupts that entirely. At this table, we are all hungry. At this table, we are all fed. At this table, we are all receivers before we are givers. The one who has bread today may need bread tomorrow. The one who needs help this week may be the one who saves your life next month. This is not charity as performance, this is mutual belonging. And that distinction matters enormously to the people who are on the receiving end of a gift, the receiving end of care. Acts says they shared everything, right? They sold property, they distributed to those in need. And I want to acknowledge that that makes most of us extremely uncomfortable, including progressive church people, including maybe you listening right now, because when the Bible, when pastors start talking about property and possession and money, suddenly everybody gets a little nervous. Because now our faith is touching our economics. Now faith is touching ownership. Now faith is touching the stuff we were quietly told, we were formed our whole lives to believe that if we accumulated enough of it, that it could save us, keep us safe. But Acts does not let faith stay abstract, does it? The Spirit changes how they related to their resources, not just to each other. And this isn't me saying that resources are bad, and ownership isn't automatically evil, and it's not because everyone must have exactly the same, but because the Spirit breaks the spell of scarcity. And scarcity is not only an economic condition, scarcity is a spiritual formation. It trains us to fear each other. It trains us to hide. It trains us to say, I have to protect mine, and then build theology around that protectiveness. And then we call it wisdom. Kwok Pulan's work on post-colonial imagination is clarifying here. She argues that Western Christianity has been so thoroughly shaped by the assumptions of empire, including empire of private property and possessive individualism, that we have largely lost the capacity to imagine a shared life as anything other than a threat. The table becomes metaphor precisely because actually sharing resources feels too radical. We spiritualize what Acts meant concretely. Her phrase for what the rainbow flag welcome without structural change actually is hospitality as management of difference. It makes difference visible, tolerates it, even celebrates it aesthetically. But it does not share power. It does not redistribute resources. It does not make change. It does not change who makes decisions, whose needs everything gets organized around. That is the management of difference. That's not belonging. Poulin says this: the post-colonial imagination challenges the church to go beyond hospitality as management of difference and towards a genuine sharing of life, power, and resources. The Spirit forms a different kind of people, a people who can ask, what do we have? Who needs it? How do we share it? And what structure would help us do this faithfully and sustainably over time? Because generosity without structure depends on our mood, doesn't it? If I feel generous, I'll help. If I notice need, I'll respond. If I remember, I'll call. But that all depends, all that care depends on spontaneous kindness. If we do that, we'll always miss people. People will fall through the cracks when care is not organized. People will go hungry when generosity has no infrastructure. People burn out when care is always improvised and never distributed. So the early church did not just have warm feelings about each other, they organized their resources. They created patterns of care. They made sure needs were met. And this is where imaginary resistance gets very concrete. So let me ask some real questions. What would it look like to build a mutual aid fund with actual money in it? What would it look like to have a care team whose specific job was to notice who was absent from your gathering this week? What would it look like to organize meals not only when someone has a baby or a surgery, but when someone's depressed or grieving or transitioning or just overwhelmed? What would it look like to build a pride care fund specifically for queer and trans people facing family rejection, housing instability, or mental health crisis? Not as a one-time gesture during Pride Month, but as a permanent line in the budget. What would it look like to stop saying, let us know if you need anything, and start asking, would groceries, a ride, a meal, babysitting, or company help you this week? What would it look like to make sure no one in this community has to ask 3 times before someone responds? Pierre would call this praxis. The insistence that reflection and action belong together, that you cannot have one without betraying the other. A community that only reflects care without practicing it is doing ideology. A community that acts without reflection will reproduce the patterns it's trying to dismantle. Reflection and action together, that's where transformation lives. That's the Acts 2, right? That's when we look at the page and it jumps off the page into the room. In Pedagogy of the Press, he says, the act of naming the world, of transforming it through action and reflection is not a privilege of the few, but the birthright of everyone. Meeting people's needs, this is not separate from worship. This is worship becoming material. This is prayer with a grocery list, communion with a budget. This is prophecy with a casserole. This is love organized into a system. I want to end this today in a different register because this episode carries real weight, and I don't want to leave it sitting entirely in the territory of obligation. Because here is what Acts says: they shared food with gladness and simplicity. Gladness. That word is doing important work. I think we owe it some attention. When we talk about building systems of care and redistributing resources and organizing mutual aid, it can start to feel like a heavy obligation. Don't get me wrong, it is serious work, and I'm not minimizing that. But the table is not only duty, it's not only obligation. The table is joy. And resistance that has no joy in it will not last. Community that runs entirely on obligation will burn people out. Justice work sustained only by guilt will eventually eat itself. The table has to give people something to come back to. And that something, according to Acts, is gladness. It's not a shallow joy. It's not performative positivity that papers over the real pain. It's not the forced cheerfulness of an institution that cannot tolerate grief, but the kind of joy that happens when people who thought they were alone discover that they're not alone. The kind of joy that happens when a queer person sits down at a table and does not have to edit themselves for the first time in years. When a trans person is called by their name without hesitation or awkwardness. When an elder is actually listened to, not managed or thanked and moved along, but genuinely listened to. When a young person realizes their vision matters and the people around them feel like it matters. The kind of joy that happens when scarcity loses its grip for a moment. And we remember in our bodies, rather than just in our theology, that we actually belong to each other. Brueggemann argues that one of the primary functions of prophetic community is what he calls public grief and public joy. The willingness to feel the full weight of what is broken and the full delight of what is being repaired. Together, in community, without privatizing either one. That is what gladness looks like in Acts. Not the individual spiritual satisfaction, but communal aliveness, shared food, shared life, shared praise. Joy that happens in public between people around an actual table. Brueggemann goes on to say the alternative community must be more than an act of criticism. It must be an act of alternative enjoyment, a community of amazement, delight, and energy. An alternative community of amazement. That's what we're reaching for, isn't it, friend? Not a community that's very good at criticizing what's wrong with the world. We're all pretty good at that. But a community that demonstrates concretely and joyfully that another way is possible. That people can eat together across real difference. That needs can be named without shame. That resources can be shared without maintaining a hierarchy of givers and receivers. That a queer kid rejected by their family of origin can find a table where they're not merely tolerated, but where they're genuinely celebrated. Jesus didn't say, I came that they might survive and survive minimally. He said that he came that we might have life and have it abundantly. The table-shaped community is not just trying to keep people from dying. It is helping people live. It's helping people eat and laugh and rest and tell stories and to be known. It's helping people be missed when they're gone and be welcomed when they come back. Be reminded repeatedly and concretely that their life matters. Despair wants us isolated. Fear wants us suspicious. Scarcity wants us hoarding. Shame wants us hiding. The table gathers us. The table feeds us. The table teaches us to laugh again. The table reminds us that another world is not only possible. Sometimes it's already happening over dinner. So what is the table? It's not just a symbol or furniture or communion language or a metaphor for inclusion that lets us progressives feel like we're doing the best without changing anything structural. The table is a system of care and shared resources and truth-telling about need and abundance, a system that resists scarcity and turns strangers into neighbors and neighbors into family. Acts 2 says they devoted themselves to teaching, community, shared meals and prayers. They shared what they had. They distributed to anyone in need, ate together with gladness and simplicity, praised God, and more people were added to their community. Why? Maybe because people saw something they were hungry for. Not just a good sermon with good production values, not just an institution with affirming language on its website, a people whose life together said, you do not have to survive alone. You do not have to hide your need. You do not have to disappear when things get hard. There is room and food and truth and joy at this table. Kwok Pulon says the post-colonial imagination begins with discerning that something is not fitting. That's where we start. The welcome without belonging model is not fitting. The charity without mutuality model is not fitting. The inspiration without infrastructure model is not fitting. Something has to change. Not just our language, not just our signs, but in our structure, our budget, our calendar, our practices, our actual organized life together. And when the table becomes a system, love becomes visible. When the table becomes a system, belonging stops being a word and starts being an experience. When the table becomes a system, deliverance gets a place to live, not in theory, not someday, but here, around the table, among these people, right now. Thanks for being here, friend. If this episode found you somewhere real, share it with someone who's tired of welcome that never quite becomes belonging. Find us at missiongathering.com. All the links are in the show notes. And this week, if you can, set the table. Set it with food and time and attention. Set it with a phone call, a check-in, a budget line, a plan. Set it with joy and stubborn belief that the Spirit did not create us to be isolated religious consumers. The Spirit created us to be a people. Welcome to the table. I'll see you next week, friend.